Our reading from the Word this morning is from Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, 1 through 8. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every matter under heaven. A time to birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace.
Good morning. Once again, I appreciate your presence here and appreciate your dedication to the kingdom. Appreciate your dedication to God and His Word to be here and to be ready to engage in a Bible study this morning and worship and studying from His Word during this hour. And we're undertaking what could be a difficult topic today. We're going to talk about death, and that sometimes isn't a very fun topic to think about, to talk about, especially in the midst of some of the world events, especially in the midst of personal loss that some people may be suffering, or imminent loss that some may be facing. The topic of death is one of those that can be tricky to do in a way that that still lets us leave here feeling like we've studied God's Word first and foremost, but lets us leave here feeling uplifted and hopeful as something that we need to do. So the passage that was just read, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we're really not going to spend a lot of time in that passage. It was just read as a reminder that death is something that we all must face. It starts off, there's a time to give birth and a time to die. That's how that whole series of things begins, with a discussion about there's a time when birth is taking place, and we celebrate that, we enjoy that, we talk about it. We've been talking a lot about that lately as we've got so many young families in our sphere of influence that are, where that is taking place right now. So many people that were celebrating the time of birthing that is taking place. But then we also, if you look at our prayer list, we have a number of people who either have dealt with recent losses, or we have loved ones that are facing loss possibly very soon. And it's just part of life. It's just something that we have to deal with. It's something that is part of our shared existence in this world. And so we've been looking at a book here recently that talks about the three spheres of existence and what comes after this life, what happens next. That's the title of the book, and there's still a few copies of that book left on that back table. If you haven't picked one of those up, or if you'd like to get into that book and read through it. And these lessons that I'm giving on the third Sunday of the month, they're kind of an overview of the chapters of that book. I'm leaving stuff out, believe it or not. As you look at the outline and as you listen to the lessons, there are things that I'm just not able to cover, and there's some things that are more speculative in nature as we talk about some of these things. Some things that the Scriptures don't rule out, but don't necessarily mean that we all have to understand or agree the exact same thing about some things relating to death this week in particular, but in other areas as well. And so if you want to read through that book and see some of those things that are being left out of the lessons, that would be a good exercise. But we introduced in the introduction lesson that we talked about, we presented this slide that he presents in the book. There are three spheres of existence where he talks about this world, and then the next sphere of existence is Hades or Sheol, death, and then there is a final sphere of existence, which is eternity. And last month we talked about this world. We talked about the world that we live in and how we interact with that world and how that world was designed for us and why God put us in that world and all of those kind of things. And today we are talking about death, and death is that dividing line between the first two spheres of existence. Death is the dividing line between this world and Hades. And so as Glenn Elliott once said, if you remember way back years ago, he said, if you live long enough, you'll die. It's something that we all must face. Ecclesiastes 3 tells us that there is a time to live, there is a time to die. Everyone who lives in this existence has to face this topic of death. We have to deal with that topic, whether or not it affects us personally by happening to us before the Lord returns, but certainly it will happen to those that we love. Certainly it will happen to those within our orbits of existence. So it is a topic that we need to be okay discussing. We need to be okay talking about it and understanding that it is something that we're going to have to deal with. Go ahead and move to the next one. The next one is just kind of focuses in on those first two spheres of existence, and we see death there as that dividing line between this world and Hades. And so our focus this morning is literally on that line. What is it that line, that death, as we know it, what is it, and what does it mean? What is it? How do we prepare for it? What do we do with it? What do we do with the knowledge that we have about death? And what questions are we left with? Because we certainly don't have all of the questions answered that we'd like to have answered about many things. So we'll look at some of the things that are presented in the book. The first thing that he does, and I appreciate, is that he presents the idea of understanding what death is by talking about what death is not. Because there are some misunderstandings out there. There's some things, some theories, some ideas, some religions, some philosophies, whatever you want to call them, floating around out there. And some of those affect even the way that people within the church, within our body, might have as their understanding about death. And we want to look and see what death is not. And the first thing that we see, death is not extinction. Death is not the end. The Bible is very clear on that. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, beginning in verse 13, Paul writing there says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep." And there, the word sleep is used as a metaphor for death, and that's used several times throughout the Scriptures. Jesus used it even in one of the miracles that he performed. That he said the young girl is not dead, but is merely asleep, and people laughed at him. And here the word sleep is used as a metaphor for death. So we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep or those who are dead, that you may not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall not precede those who have fallen asleep, those who have died. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words. And so we have here Paul painting a very clear picture, or a picture for us at least, about some of the things that will transpire at the end of time, at the judgment. And that's for a lesson later on. Some of these things kind of intertwine with one another. And so we'll see some of these scriptures various times as we cover this topic. But Paul here, talking about the judgment, talks about those who have died. And so those who have crossed over from this life into that Hadean world, into that next realm, they're not going to be left behind. They've not ceased to exist. They've not been forgotten about. They will be raised, and they will participate in the judgment. They're still a real being. They're still in the picture. And so we need to understand that while some philosophies, whether they be atheistic philosophies or even some theistic philosophies that teach the idea that once this physical body ceases to function, that we are dead, and that's it. That's the end of life. We need to understand that is not at all what the Bible teaches. The Bible very clearly teaches that there is life after this physical death takes place. Another thing that death is not what he refers to as soul sleep. And I don't know that I've ever heard those exact words before, but I've heard the concept. And the concept is that upon death, upon the physical body dying, then the spirit, the soul, just goes into kind of a hibernation, kind of a sleep, if you will. And it just remains there asleep, hibernating until the return of the Lord. And when the Lord returns, then the soul is awakened to face judgment. And so there's some who teach this philosophy, some who teach this doctrine. But we see from Luke chapter 16, verses 19 and following, that this is not the way at all that Jesus presents death. As Jesus is telling the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and this is a story that we'll refer back to a lot over the next few chapters of the book as we look at some of the details about the Hadean world, and we looked at examples about judgment and things as well. We'll be reviewing this story a lot, so we're not going to read the whole thing today, but it just starts out, now there was a certain rich man, and he had habitually dressed in purple, fine linen, gaily living in splendor every day. And a certain poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores and longing to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. Besides, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores. Now it came about that the poor man died, and he was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. And the rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus on his bosom. And so that's all we want to cover for now, because it kind of deals with the topic at hand. What is death not? Death is not soul sleep. Death is not hibernation. Our soul falling into a sense of stupor that just remains until the time that we are resurrected for the judgment. Because very clearly, the rich man and Lazarus, once they have died and left this physical world and gone to the Hadean realm, they are conscious. They are aware of their surroundings. They know what's going on around them. And so death is a transition. It is a transition from one sphere of existence into the next. But that next sphere of existence, there is consciousness. There is understanding. There is knowledge about the things that are going on around you. And so death is not extinction. It is not hibernation or soul sleep. So what is physical death then? And we want to be clear that for part of this we'll be talking about the physical aspect of death, because in a physical sense you could get a very clinical picture from a doctor, from somebody who deals with death on a regular basis, about the processes that are taking place within the body as the body shuts down and the organs cease to function and the heart stops beating and the brain waves stop and all of those things. And there's a clinical definition of what death is, and that really, while I'm sure it interests some of us and we have questions about that, that really is not what we're here to discuss now. If you want to know a clinical definition, a medical definition of death, there are other people that you could talk to that would know more than me, or you could Google that, I'm sure, and get a pretty clear definition of it. But we want to talk about physical death from a scriptural standpoint, from a biblical standpoint. What is physical death? And quite simply, physical death is separation. It's the separation of the soul or the spirit from the body. Remember last month, when we talked about this world and the creation and how God formed man from the dust of the ground and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And it's not that we are a body with a soul, but we're a soul with a body. And there's that unification of body and soul that constitutes life, that constitutes physical life. And when there is a removal of that relationship between body and spirit, then physical death has taken place. And so we see that in several scriptures. In Psalm 146, verses 3 and 4, the psalmist there says, "Do not trust in princes, in mortal man, in whom there is no salvation. His spirit departs, he returns to the earth. In that very day his thoughts perish." And so there's that separation of spirit and body. His spirit departs, but his body returns to the earth. And so there's that separation, and that's where death has taken place. That's what death is. But remember, it's not a cessation of the spirit from existence or a sleeping of that spirit. His spirit departs. His spirit is still active. His spirit goes somewhere else, but his body is what returns to the earth. Look also at James 2, verse 26. James 2, verse 26, that great chapter or section of James about faith and how our faith should be paired with works so that faith is meaningful. He concludes that section by saying in verse 26, "For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also without works faith is dead." And so that idea of the body without the spirit is dead, and I've talked before about my upbringing with the Old American Standard, and in the Old American Standard, that verse reads, "For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, even so faith apart from works is dead. And so the body apart from the spirit is dead. When the spirit departs, the body dies. That is physical death. Not that the spirit has ceased to exist, not that the spirit has died, but the body ceases to exist when the spirit departs. And then Genesis 35, we have the story of Rachel, that she was giving birth to her youngest son Benjamin, and as she is giving birth, it says there in chapter 35, verse 18, it says, "It came to pass, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin." And so as Rachel is dying, her spirit is departing from her body, and her last act before her spirit departs is to give name to her son, which her husband then changes. But the point there is that she is dying. Her spirit departs from her body, and that is the moment of her physical death. Another distinction there that I found kind of an interesting little paragraph or two that he had in the book was this discussion of, is it a soul or is it a spirit? And yes, as Gary likes to say, yes. The answer is yes to that question. Is it a soul or is it a spirit? Well, it's kind of interchangeable. And if you look at some passages like Job's chapter 7, verse 11, it says, "Therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul." And Job there, we understand the context in which Job is saying those things, that he's lost everything, literally. He's lost all of his possessions. He's lost his children. He's lost his health. He's lost everything that meant anything to him. And he is crying out from his soul, from his spirit. Well, which one is it? Well, yes, he's crying out from that innermost part of his being. And that is that's where this lament is originating from. And then in Isaiah 26, verse 9, we have a similar situation. It says, "At night my soul longs for you. Indeed, my spirit within me seeks you diligently." Well, which is it? Is it my soul that longs for God, or is it my spirit that longs for God? Well, yes. They are one and the same. They are used interchangeably there in those passages. So as we think about what physical death is, well, it's the departure of the spirit, departure of the soul from the physical body. And in that moment, the physical body is no longer animated. That which animated the body, that it's gone. It has moved on to another plane of existence. And so the physical body then ceases to function. Another section in the book there that he deals with, he asks the question, why do we die? And it's a fair question. Why do we die? Why does God put us in this situation or in this body, and then we have to look forward to death? I think Benjamin Franklin is attributed with the saying, there are two certainties in life, right? Death and taxes. And if you want to start a fight, try talking about either one of them. But there are two things that we can be assured of. And one of them is that we're going to die. And so we need to come to terms with it. We need to face that reality. And part of facing that reality is asking that question, why? Why do we die? What's the plan here? Well, the first thing we need to understand is it wasn't the plan from the beginning. God didn't create us for the purpose of us dying. That wasn't his reason for giving us life, so that we could die. His plan was different from the very beginning. Look at Genesis 2, verse 16 and 17. It says, "The Lord God commanded the man, saying, From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat it, for in the day that you eat it you will surely die." See, death hadn't happened yet. Death wasn't in the picture before Adam and Eve ate of that tree that was forbidden. And as long as they stayed away from that tree, as long as they didn't eat from that tree, death would not have come into the picture. And so it wasn't God's plan from the beginning for death to be part of our existence. So when we ask the question, why do we die? Why is death a thing? We have to put it in the context of what takes place in the book of Genesis. And from the beginning, God didn't intend it to be so. God did not intend for us to have to deal with physical death. But what it comes down to is that it is a consequence of sin. Death entered the picture because of sin. And if you look over at Genesis chapter 3, Genesis chapter 3 has the story of the beginning of death in the history of mankind. And we'll not read the whole chapter, but we'll read the first section there, verses 1 through 7. It says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Indeed, has God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat from it, nor touch it, lest you die. And the serpent said to the woman, You surely shall not die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate it. And she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. And so God had told them, you're here in the garden, and you can eat from whatever you want, but don't eat from that tree, because in the day you eat from that tree, in the day that you eat from that tree, you will surely die. And Satan says, no, that's not really true. You won't really die. And so Adam and Eve eat from the tree. And they live for, it says, Adam lived to be 900 and some years old. So really, Satan was right. Is that true? Satan was right, because God said, in the day that you eat from it, you will die, but Adam lived 900 years after he ate from it. Well, Satan was talking about physical death. God was talking about spiritual death. In the day that he ate, Adam and Eve ate from that tree, they were separated from God. And remember, what is death? Death is separation. In a physical sense, it's the separation of the soul from the body. In a spiritual sense, death is separation of the soul from God. And so on the day that Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they were separated from God. For the first time ever, they hid from God when he came into the garden. For the first time ever, there were consequences for what they had done, and God sent them out of the garden and out of his presence that day. So death, in a spiritual sense, entered the world that day, but also in a physical sense, death entered the world that day. Because God, what did he provide for them? He provided animal coverings for their clothes. Never before had an animal been killed, but now an animal had been killed to provide for them. And from that moment on, they were headed towards that appointment with physical death that they never had had to deal with before, that they had never had to consider before. And so even though it took a period of hundreds of years for it to happen, death entered the world that day as a result of their sin. Look at verse 19 there in Genesis chapter 3. It says, By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. That's part of the consequence of the sin of Adam and Eve, that they would one day return to the dust from which they'd been taken. Their bodies would one day re-enter the ground. And so, why do we die? Because of sin. Sin is the reason that we die. Romans chapter 6, verse 23 says, For the wages of sin is death. And we know that death is a result of sin, even in the New Testament sense. Also in Romans chapter 8, we have as a consequence of sin that it affected not only Adam and Eve and their relationship with God, but it affected the very earth itself. Look at it, Romans 8, beginning in verse 19. It says, For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God, for the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. Not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. And so just like in the garden, where man and woman were able to live without reference to death, either physical or spiritual death, so also creation itself existed without reference to death. There was no winding down of the natural order of things. There was no natural decay of the systems. There was no drought. There was no wasting away of plants or animals or things of that nature. And because of sin, when sin entered the picture, it affected not only Adam and Eve and their their relationship with God and their relationship with death, but it affected all of creation. So why is it that our favorite tree out in the front yard dies and we have to have it cut down and it no longer shades our house? It's because of sin. Why is it that our favorite pet dies and we have to bury it out in the yard with a marker to commemorate that it was part of our family? Why does that happen? It's because of sin. Why is death a thing? Because of sin. And so all of creation eagerly awaits the redemption that is promised by God when things will be remade and we will no longer have to live in reference to sin. The next section I feel like is maybe one of the more practical sections of the book. Why do people fear death? Why do we fear death? Is that from a rational standpoint when we talk about death, from an academic standpoint when we talk about death as believers, we kind of get that, maybe that gung-ho attitude of, well, I don't fear death. I know what waits me on the other side. I know what's there, and so I'm happy that one day I get to go and be with God, and that's a wonderful attitude to have, but aren't you just a little bit scared? Aren't you just a little bit fearful about what that process of dying is going to be like? About what the unknowns that are part of that equation will lead us through? I don't think it's a weakness of faith. I don't think it's a sign of a weak character to admit that even though we have hope, even though we have trust in what God has promised us, that it's something that we fear. Because first of all, it's unknown. I suppose I could ask, see if anybody here has died before. If you've been through it, could you tell us what it's like so that the rest of us could understand it a little better and know what it's going to be like? But it's unknown. We don't know what's going to happen from a standpoint of having experienced it or being able to kind of dissect and understand the mechanics of what's going on. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians 5, verses 1 through 9. Paul writing says, for we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, he's talking about our physical body, our earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. Inasmuch as we, having put it on, shall not be found naked. For indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed, in order that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now he who prepared us for this very purpose is God, who gave to us the Spirit as a pledge. Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We are of good courage, I say, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord. Therefore also we have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to him. Paul there is talking about the idea of being separated from our earthly tent. That's that separation of our soul from our body. And we know that as death. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about death, and he says, if the earthly tent, which is our home, which is our body, that's where, remember, we're not bodies with souls, we're souls with bodies. And so if our soul leaves this body because the body has been destroyed or the body has died, where does it go? What happens to it? It needs a home. It needs a place to reside. And he tells us that God has prepared an eternal home, an eternal residence for this soul to take up residence in. And so we know that God is going to provide a place for this soul. He's going to provide a place for us to dwell. But I haven't seen that one yet. I don't know where it's at. I don't know how to get there. I know this one. I'm comfortable here. I'm comfortable with what I know. And so the idea of giving up what we have, what we know, what we've come to accept as our home, to go on to something that even though God says it's better, even though God says it's immortal, it's permanent, it's eternal, I love that. I want it. But I'm still kind of scared to let go of what I have to go on to something that is even better. And I think that's a natural reaction for us. And Paul says the remedy there is that we walk by faith, not by sight. We have to trust God. We have to believe that what he has promised us is going to be better than what we already have. And yes, we believe that. Yes, we trust it. But boy, it still is hard to let go of that which we have. It's difficult, and it's even fearful to give up what we know for what we don't know, even when the promise of what is to come is so much greater than what we have. And so the remedy then is hope. We've been talking a lot about hope this year as part of that kingdom language that we want to use. The kingdom is founded upon hope. It's built upon hope. It doesn't exist without hope. The kingdom is the home of hope, and if there is no hope, then there is no kingdom. And as we talk about death and we talk about what comes next, hope is really what we have. 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13, we read a longer passage from 1 Thessalonians 4 a few minutes ago, but verse 13 there says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope." You know, even though it's fearful for us, it's frightening, it's unnerving to think about death, to talk about death, to consider our own death. We still do that within the context of hope. We still have that discussion and even that fear within the context of hope for something greater. Compare that to those who have no hope. Compare that to those who have no belief system, who have no understanding of God, who have no belief in a hereafter. And compare your fear, your anxiety, your worry about death to those who have no hope at all. And even though we do at times have fear associated with the topic of death, it's not the same fear. It's not the same anxiety as those who have no hope. Praise God for the hope that he has given us. It's something that we should always be thankful for, especially when we're talking about this subject. So a couple of final thoughts, and here's part where, believe it or not, I'm skipping over some of the things that he puts in the book, and I'm just going to cover a couple of little topics here, because there's a couple of areas that he gets into that are really, in my estimation, pretty speculative about some things regarding death and some discussion that he has there, and I don't feel like this is the avenue for speculation up here. And if you want to read through that chapter and kind of have some of those discussions later, that's an interesting discussion, but it's just not. I don't feel like my job is to get up here and speculate about things. So a couple of things that we can address that he does bring up in the book in this final section about death. He brings up the idea of what happens in that moment of death. How does your spirit know where to go? Like your spirit and your body are separated. The physical body is now dead, and the spirit remains. And if you've ever, gone on a trip and your GPS didn't work, you've been lost before. Or maybe even if your GPS did work, you've been lost. But what is our spiritual GPS? How do we get from where we are to where we need to be in the next sphere of existence? And so he brings up the idea of an angel escort, which I think is an interesting topic, and one that may be one of those things that leaves us with more questions than answers, but it's dealt with it there in Luke chapter 16, when the rich man and Lazarus, both of them pass, or both of them die. Verse 22, Luke 16 verse 22 says, "Now it came about that the poor man died, and he was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom." How did he know where to go? How did he know how to get from where he was at, which is his soul, his spirit being separated from his body? And again, I don't know what that's like, but I can't imagine that it's a jarring experience. I can't imagine that it's disorientating, that it is difficult to go through. And so the soul is removed from the body, it's separated from the body. Where does it go? How does it get there? But God provides a guide. God provides somebody or angelic beings to guide that spirit to its next realm of existence. Now, it doesn't say what happens when the rich man dies. In the next verse, or in the same verse, at the end of the verse, it says, "And the rich man also died and was buried." And so how did he know where to go? How did he get there? And how did he If he, I wouldn't have wanted to go where he was going. And so how does he get there without being able to take a detour of some kind? Well, I would imagine that there perhaps are guides that take him along the way as well. And so, in that moment of death, there, according to the scriptures, seems to be an indication that there will be angels that will guide us to that next sphere of existence. And hopefully, if we are like Lazarus in this story, it is a calming experience. It is a reassuring experience. It's an experience that lets us know that it's going to be okay, versus the experience that the rich man had in this story. Another question that he brings up in the book is the idea of kind of, at the resurrection, the idea of a resurrection. What if our bodies were burned? What about cremation? What about being buried at sea? What about some of those things that sometimes we have to consider with the topic of death? And what happens to our physical bodies? And is there difficulty for God if something were to happen to our physical bodies that it can't be reunited or rejoined with our spirits at the resurrection? And so just a couple of passages that we want to look at. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 came to mind and gives us some insight. 1 Corinthians 15, beginning in verse 51, says, "Behold, I tell you a mystery, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed." And so there's that sleep as a metaphor for death. We will not all die. So the judgment, the resurrection, will take place before every human being has died. There will be those who are alive at the resurrection. He says, "In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, and the mortal must put on immortality. But when this perishable will have put on imperishable, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then will come about the saying that is written, O death is swallowed up in victory." And so death is going to be done away with. The effects of death are going to be overridden at the resurrection. And so, but it's not just a one-for-one switch where it's just going to be this body that's resurrected. There's going to be something different. This body is going to be changed from something that is perishable, that's from something that decays, whether it decays through fire, whether it decays underground, whether it decays underwater. However it decays, it's going to be traded in for something that will not decay. It's going to be changed. And so this mortal, this perishable body is going to be changed into an immortal, imperishable body that then will be reunited with the soul so that the soul has an eternal place to live. 1 John chapter 3, verse 2 also lends to this. It says, "It has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, for we will see him just as he is." So even John there is writing, I'm not sure what it's going to be like. It hasn't been revealed to us exactly what we're going to be like, but we know that we'll be different than we are now because we're going to be like him. And we will see him like he is, and in that process of seeing him, we will be changed into something that is more like his existence. And so what we have now, our physical existence, our physical bodies, they will be raised and they will be changed into something different. Then Revelation 20, verses 12 and 13, again says, "I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne. The books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds." We're not talking about the judgment part now. We're talking about the dead part now. So the dead were raised, and they were there to stand before God. So there was a reanimation of those who were dead, whether they had been lost at sea, whether they were great or small. And we know that some of those great kings had had things like their bodies had been torn apart, they had been beheaded, they had been separated, body parts had been separated and sent to various parts of the kingdom. We read stories like that. Others had been burned. And so we know that regardless of their form of death, or regardless of what happened to them in death, they still were reanimated in some sense to be able to stand before God for that moment of judgment. So what happens when you die from a physical standpoint, or do we have a preference, about burial versus cremation versus embalming versus not embalming versus whatever. Well, God formed us from the dust of the ground to begin with, and he animated us from that dust of the ground in the beginning. So if we are reduced to ashes, or we are buried in the ground, or whatever, God still has the power to reanimate us, to reform us, and make us reunite once again with our souls. So some interesting questions there at the end of the chapter about some practical things involving death. It all comes down to this. He says in the opening of the book that we get a keyhole picture. And maybe in today's vernacular, kids today maybe don't know what it's like to look through a keyhole and see partial bit of the room that's behind that keyhole and try to figure out what everything that's going on inside that room. But he presents it in that way that all of this that we're talking about now, that we get this keyhole view. We have lots of questions. And sometimes the more we study it, the more questions we end up with. I know I still have lots of questions about the process of dying and about what happens in that moment of death, and what are the angels there to do, and how do they do it, and all those things. I have lots of questions. And some of those questions can't be answered until I experience death. They just can't be. But there's one question that we all can answer right now. And that question is, are you ready? Are you ready for death? I'm not asking if you want to die right now. I'm asking, are you ready if that moment is now? Are you ready for what comes next? And every one of us has the ability to answer that question. And if you're not, why would you wait? Why would you wait to get ready? Why would you leave here today not knowing if you're ready? Because death is final. Death is that line of demarcation between this world and the next. And what we learn from the rich man and Lazarus is there's no changing once death has taken place. So answer that question for yourself this morning. Are you ready? If you're not, I hope that you'll get ready. You can get ready today if you'll come while we stand and sing.